He spent the night holding a stranger's hand, performing a duty no amount of money could buy. She spent her final hours comforted by a man paid just over minimum wage, while her billionaire son's private jet was still in the air. The nurse was Alex Carter, a single father working double shifts to keep the lights on. The son was tech founder Elias Thorne, whose fortune could solve any problem, except the one unfolding in a quiet hospital room. This is what happens when compassion and capital meet at the worst possible moment, and what a billionaire learns when money is no longer an answer. To understand that night, you have to understand the two worlds on a collision course. In one, a man measured his worth in bedtime stories and overtime. In the other, a man measured his in billions and board approvals. For Alex Carter, the night shift at St. Vincent's wasn't a job, it was a lifeline. The differential pay helped cover the rent for their small apartment and his daughter Chloe's asthma medication. At 32, his life was a meticulously balanced equation of bus schedules, pediatrician appointments, and 12-hour shifts. His uniform was blue scrubs, permanently faintly stained with bleach. His most valuable tools weren't scalpels or syringes, but patience and a gentle touch, assets that didn't appear on any hospital balance sheet but were in desperate, silent demand. The emotional calculus of his work was brutal. A recent survey found 59% of nurses experience burnout, a number that spikes on oncology and palliative care floors. Alex worked the medical surgical unit, a catchment for the sickest patients, where death was not a rare visitor. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to offer warmth without letting it consume him, because falling apart wasn't an option when you were the only parent a 7-year-old had waiting at home. Then there was Elias Thorne. At 48, he was the visionary founder and CEO of Etha Systems, a quantum computing firm recently valued at $94 billion. His world was one of private helicopters, keynote speeches, and solving problems that hadn't been invented yet. His mother, Eleanor, was his last tether to a life before the fortune. A retired librarian, she had raised him alone, her quiet stability the foundation for his relentless ambition. But as his empire grew, his visits became scheduled quarterly events, brief flashes of filial duty between tectonic business deals. The fractured lines appeared subtly at first. Eleanor, always sharp, began forgetting their weekly phone calls. Then a neighbor found her confused in the garden. Tests revealed an aggressive glioblastoma, a terminal brain cancer. Elias' response was quintessentially Thorne. He moved her to the best hospital money could access, St. Vincent's, and hired a team of private specialists. He solved the problem with capital, believing superior resources could bend even biological fate. He visited once, the room filled with blinking, rented equipment, his presence awkward amidst the sterile efficiency. He promised to return soon, a promise immediately buried under the urgency of a looming product launch. He didn't know that his mother, amidst the dementia brought on by the tumor, had given strict, lucid instructions months prior. No extraordinary measures, just comfort. And so, as her condition deteriorated, the private specialists, their contract fulfilled, stepped back. Eleanor Thorne was moved to a quiet room on the general floor for end-of-life care. She became just another patient, her chart flagged for comfort measures only. Her billionaire son was listed as next of kin, but he was in Palo Alto, finalizing a deal that would add another $3 billion to his net worth. This is where the systems of two men intersected. On a rainy Thursday night, Alex Carter started his shift. His daughter was with a neighbor, her inhaler on the kitchen counter. His first rounds were routine until he entered room 317. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of a heart monitor that had been silenced. In the bed lay Eleanor Thorne, small and frail, her breathing shallow and irregular. The chart stated no family had visited in 72 hours. The do not resuscitate order was prominent. Her only prescribed medication was morphine for air hunger. For Alex, this was the core of the nursing compact. A patient dying alone was a professional and moral failure. Studies on end-of-life care repeatedly highlight that compassion, warmth, presence, simple human touch is the most fundamental need beyond any medicine. He adjusted her pillows, spoke softly, and checked her vitals. But as his shift neared its end at 7 a.m., a quick check revealed her condition was actively declining. The death rattle had begun. The night-charge nurse, overwhelmed with 3 incoming emergencies, gave him a weary look. Her son been notified again. Just make her comfortable. Here was the turning point. Clocking out meant relief, a chance to see Chloe before school. Staying meant unpaid hours, exhaustion, and emotional drainage. But leaving meant leaving her to die alone. The choice was binary. Alex texted his neighbor, asked her to get Chloe ready for school, and pulled a chair up to the bedside. He took Alina's cool, thin hand in his. He didn't know she was a billionaire's mother. He only knew she was someone's mother. Across the country, Elias Thorne's executive assistant finally broke through his focus. The message was stark. Your mother is actively dying. The launch party champagne turned to ash in his mouth. His private jet was prepped, but even it couldn't bend time. The cross-country flight would take 5 hours. He ordered his helicopter to stand by at the New York terminal. For the first time, Elias Thorne, solver of impossible problems, faced a countdown he could not stop. As dawn broke over the city, painting the hospital room in pale gold, Alex Carter was in his 8th consecutive hour of work. His back ached, his eyes were gritty, but he maintained a steady, reassuring pressure on Alina's hand. Her breathing grew slower, more spaced. In her final moment of consciousness, she squeezed back, a faint, reflexive gesture. Then she was gone. The monitor showed a flat line. Alex sat for a moment in the profound silence, performed the final necessities with practiced respect, and finally stood to leave the room, his own heart heavy. He was at the nurse's station, documenting the time of death, when the distinct, thunderous rhythm of rotor blades shattered the morning quiet. Staff looked at each other, confused. Moments later, the stairwell door burst open. A man in a rumpled, expensive overcoat stumbled onto the floor, his face a mask of desperate hope. It was Elias Thorne. His eyes locked onto the room number, then onto Alex, still in his scrubs, standing outside room 317. Elias rushed past him into the room, only to stop cold at the sight of the still, sheet-covered form. The reality hit him with physical force. He was too late. He turned back to the hallway, his devastation curdling into something else, a searching, furious need for a target. His gaze landed on Alex, the only person there, the nurse who had just closed his mother's chart. And he demanded to know who had let her die alone. The question hung in the sterile air, charged with a grief so sharp it felt like violence. Alex Carter, running on empty after a 16-hour day, met the billionaire's furious gaze, and his reply was not what Elias Thorne expected. She wasn't alone, Alex said, his voice quiet but steady, worn down by the night but not broken by the accusation. I was with her. Elias stared, his mind unable to process the statement. The man in the cheap scrubs, looking like he hadn't slept in a week, was claiming a presence he, the son, had failed to provide. You, who are you? Where were the doctors? Where was her private team? I'm Nurse Carter, and her team was following her wishes. Comfort measures only. My shift ended at 7. She was actively dying, so I stayed. Alex's explanation was simple, devoid of any desire for praise. It was just a statement of fact, a nurse's logic that prioritized a patient's dignity over a time clock. This was the first crack in Elias Thorne's reality. He had built a universe where every problem had a financial and technological solution. He could summon a helicopter, buy a hospital wing, hire the world's leading specialists. But he could not summon a moment back from the past. The one thing he needed to be there was the one thing his money couldn't purchase, and this exhausted stranger had given it freely. The hospital administration, alerted by the commotion of a landing helicopter and a distraught billionaire on the floor, arrived in a flurry. The director of nursing, a woman named Patricia Vance, tried to usher Elias into a private family room. He refused, planting himself in the hallway. I want to see the records. I want every minute of her care documented, and I want to know why this nurse was the only person with my mother. This was the beginning of the institutional earthquake. Elias Thorne, used to forensic audits of billion-dollar acquisitions, now turned that same ruthless scrutiny onto St. Vincent's. He demanded security footage logs for the hallway. He subpoenaed the medication administration records. He wanted names, titles, shift schedules. The implicit threat was colossal. The philanthropic wing of Ethos Systems had donated $2 million to the hospital just 18 months prior. Under that pressure, the story began to piece itself together, and it contradicted every assumption Elias had marched in with. The hallway camera showed no other visitors for the final 48 hours. The chart showed the private nurses had signed off at 10 p.m., their contractual duty fulfilled. The final nursing notes, entered by Alex Carter at 7:08 a.m., were starkly professional yet contained a telling detail. Patient resting quietly. Family notified per protocol. Continuous bedside presence provided for comfort until time of death at 0650. No distress observed. The phrase continuous bedside presence was a clinical term, but for 8 unpaid hours it meant a human being refusing to let a stranger face the abyss alone. Patricia Vance, reviewing the timeline with Elias in a tense meeting, pointed out the hard truth. Mr. Thorne, your mother's care plan was for a peaceful, natural passing. Nurse Carter followed that plan to the letter. In fact, he exceeded it. We don't require staff to stay past their shift. Most can't afford to. He did. Elias was silent, the anger leaching away, replaced by a colder, more unsettling feeling: shame. His investigation, designed to find fault, had found grace instead, and it was shining a harsh light on his own absence. He had been in a ballroom eating canapes while a man with calloused hands held his mother. But the escalation was just beginning. While Elias grappled with this, Alex Carter's world was imploding in a different way. Going home that morning, he'd missed taking his daughter Chloe to school. The neighbor was understanding, but the incident flagged his exhaustion. Then, a call from the hospital's HR department. A patient's family member, a powerful one, was conducting a formal inquiry. While they stated he wasn't under investigation, he was placed on temporary administrative duty, pulled from patient care. The loss of shift differential pay was a financial gut punch. Alex was now trapped in a nightmare of bureaucracy and quiet panic. He sat in a windowless office entering data, the silence a torture compared to the purposeful hum of the floor. He was a man built for action, for care, now reduced to a pawn in a game he didn't understand. His only sin had been an act of kindness, and it had potentially cost him his livelihood. This is the brutal paradox of nursing burnout. The very compassion that defines good care is often what the system, through understaffing and administrative pressure, grinds out of its workers. Meanwhile, Elias Thorne did something uncharacteristic. He stopped. He canceled his meetings and retreated to his penthouse, a space usually buzzing with strategy but now echoing with silence. He requested the one thing he had avoided, the personal effects from his mother's room. Among her few things was a small notebook. On the last page she had written in a shaky but determined script a few lines. The young man with the kind eyes came again. He reads the paper to me. He doesn't know the stories, but he tries. It's nice not to be alone. The young man was Alex. The stories were from the Financial Times, the only newspaper available. Elias broke down. The evidence was now incontrovertible. His mother, in her fatting consciousness, had noted the compassion of a minimum-wage nurse, while her son, the billionaire, was a footnote in her final days only as a name on a notification list. This was the major pivot. The narrative flipped entirely. The villain wasn't the hospital or the nurse. The failure wasn't in the care provided, but in the care asterisk not provided by the person who owed it most. Elias had approached this as a systems failure to be litigated. He now saw it as a human failure to be mourned, and his own was the largest. Driven by this gut-wrenching revelation, Elias made a decision. He wouldn't destroy the nurse who had been there for his mother, he would find him. He returned to St. Vincent's not with lawyers but alone. He went to the nursing administration office and asked Patricia Vance where he could find Alex Carter. She was wary, protective of her staff. "Why? Your inquiry is ongoing. He's on admin leave." "I don't want to interrogate him," Elias said, the arrogance gone from his voice, replaced by a raw sincerity that surprised even him. "I need to thank him." The request was so opposite to the expected threat of a lawsuit that it gave Vance pause. After a moment, she relented. "He's in the records department today, but Mr. Thorne, he's a good man. He's got a young kid. This situation has him scared. Tread lightly." Elias found the claustrophobic records office. Alex was at a desk, staring at a spreadsheet, his posture defeated. He looked up as the door opened and his body tensed, seeing the billionaire who had stormed the floor. He stood, bracing for the next blow. "Nurse Carter," Elias began, then faltered. The speech he'd rehearsed vanished. "Alex, can we talk?" What followed was a conversation in a stark hospital courtyard that would change both their lives. Elias didn't offer excuses. He simply said, "I reviewed everything. I know what you did for my mother. I know you stayed when you didn't have to. I am so grateful, and I am so sorry for how I approached you." Alex guarded just nodded. "It's my job." "But it wasn't," Elias insisted. "Staying 8 hours unpaid isn't in your job description. Reading the Financial Times to a dying woman isn't in your job description. That was human." He took a breath. "My mother wrote about you in her notebook. She said you had kind eyes." For the first time, Alex's professional composure slipped. He looked away, blinking hard. That small, personal detail was the validation no performance review could ever provide. "She was a lovely woman," he said quietly. "She talked about you. She was proud." Those 5 words shattered Elias Thorne. He had expected resentment, fear, maybe a demand for compensation. He didn't expect absolution. The conversation shifted. Elias asked about Alex's life, about Chloe. He learned about the asthma, the struggle with rent, the constant math of survival that defined Alex's existence. Elias saw the real-time cost of the compassion he'd benefited from. It was a life of perpetual near-crisis. And Alex, in turn, saw a different man from the furious air of the morning. He saw a son hollowed out by regret, trying clumsily to connect. The power dynamic had utterly dissolved. They were just 2 men, one grieving a mother, the other worrying about a daughter, linked by 8 quiet hours in a hospital room. Elias left that conversation with a new, overwhelming imperative. Gratitude wasn't enough. He had to fix what he had broken. He called the hospital CEO and personally requested Alex be reinstated to full duty immediately, with no mark on his record. He then asked his assistant to find the best pediatric pulmonologist in the city for a child named Chloe Carter. But Elias Thorne was a strategist. He saw a problem larger than one man's debts. He had witnessed the fragile ecosystem of care that had almost collapsed under his own anger. He saw the exhausted nurse, the overwhelmed system, the invisible labor that held patients together. And he decided to leverage his one superpower, his capital, not for vengeance but for repair. He scheduled a meeting with the hospital board for the following week, with a proposal they couldn't ignore. He didn't know that his actions, however well-intentioned, were about to trigger a chain reaction he couldn't control. Because pulling a single thread in the complex web of hospital politics, funding, and staff morale can unravel the whole tapestry. And as Elias prepared to write a check to solve a problem, he was stepping into a world where money wasn't just a solution. It was a weapon, a destabilizer, and a target. Across town, Alex Carter returned to his floor, to the work he loved, relief washing over him. But a new anxiety had taken root. The billionaire knew his name, his daughter's name, his struggles. What did that kind of attention really mean? Was it salvation, or was it the prelude to a different, more subtle kind of ruin? The helicopter had left, but the storm was just beginning to build. The first check cleared without a problem. $5 million deposited into a newly created St. Vincent's Compassionate Care Endowment. Elias Thorne saw it as a fix. The hospital saw it as a lifeline. But for the people on the floor, it was the first domino in a chain of chaos. Elias' proposal to the hospital board was simple. Use the fund's interest to provide small stipends to staff who provided documented, extraordinary emotional support, and to offer mental health grants for nurses experiencing burnout. It was a gesture of repair, born from his mother's notebook. The board, facing a budget shortfall and a donor threatening to walk, voted unanimously to accept. Press releases were drafted, lauding a new era of partnership between philanthropy and frontline care. The reaction inside the hospital walls was a fractured line. Administration was elated. Many nurses, including Alex, were cautiously hopeful. Maybe this meant real help, but a significant veteran contingent saw it differently. To them, it was a billionaire trying to buy a conscience, and worse, it created a perverse incentive. Would nurses now compete for compassion credits? Would their normal, unpaid kindness now require paperwork to be valued? The fund, intended to heal, instantly bred resentment and division. Then the media found the story. A business reporter at the Wall Street Journal tipped off about the unusual donation earmarked for emotional labor, dug deeper. She uncovered the helicopter landing, the death of Eleanor Thorne and the nurse who stayed. The article published with the headline, "The Billionaire and the Nurse, a story of grief, guilt, and a $5 million thank you." It went viral overnight. The narrative was irresistible but dangerously simplified. It painted Elias as the repentant titan, using his wealth to atone for his absence. It painted Alex as the saintly, struggling single dad, the angel nurse. It reduced a complex, painful human interaction to a tidy, emotional fable, and it put a blinding, invasive spotlight on two men who were not prepared for it. For Elias, it was a nuisance, a swarm of interview requests. For Alex, it was an extinction-level event. Reporters camped outside his apartment building. His daughter Chloe was photographed on her way to school. His colleagues, already strained by the endowment drama, now viewed him with a mix of awe and suspicion. Was he a humble hero, or was he secretly courting the fame? The very privacy he needed to survive and do his job evaporated. The hospital, sensing a public relations goldmine, doubled down. They asked Alex to participate in a photo op with Elias and the hospital's CEO, presenting an oversized check. Alex refused, wanting the attention to fade. Administration pressure mounted subtly. Wasn't he part of the team? Didn't he want to help the hospital secure more funding? It was emotional blackmail wrapped in institutional logic. And then came the "wait, it gets worse" moment. It arrived not from a boardroom, but from a child's lungs. 3 weeks after the article, Chloe Carter suffered a severe asthma attack at home. It was late and Alex was at work. The babysitter called 911. But when the ambulance arrived, its path was blocked by a news van and 2 photographers, staking out the Angel Nurses building for a follow-up story. The delay was 90 seconds. In respiratory distress, 90 seconds is an eternity. Chloe was rushed to St. Vincent's, the same hospital where her father worked. Alex, paged to the emergency room, arrived to see his daughter on a gurney, an oxygen mask on her face, her small chest heaving. The doctor said the delay in arrival had exacerbated the crisis. She would be okay, but she needed to be admitted. Standing in that ER, the roar of the media circus outside, Alex Carter reached his breaking point. The billionaire's gratitude had morphed into a monster. His act of kindness had been commodified, and now it had almost cost his daughter her life. The emotion he had managed so professionally for years, the compartmentalized grief, the stress, boiled over into a silent, shaking rage. He didn't blame Elias, not directly. He blamed the attention. He blamed the system that turned a human moment into a transaction and a headline. He requested emergency family leave and retreated to Chloe's bedside, shutting out the world. When Elias Thorne heard what happened, his assistant monitoring the news alerts, he felt a nausea more profound than when he'd learned of his mother's death. This was cause and effect, written in the terrified face of a little girl. His money, his attempt to fix, had actively harmed the very people he wanted to help. He had become the bull in the china shop of their lives. He went to the hospital, not with cameras, but in a common taxi, a baseball cap pulled low. He bought a stuffed animal from the gift shop, a ridiculous blue dinosaur. He didn't know if he'd be thrown out, but he had to try. He found Alex in Chloe's room. The little girl was sleeping, her breathing steadier. Alex looked up, his expression hollow, drained of all fight. Elias didn't offer excuses. He placed the dinosaur on a chair. "I am so sorry," he said, the words utterly inadequate. "This is my fault, all of it." Alex just stared out the window. "You wanted to help, I get it. But your help, it's like a tidal wave. It doesn't ask what we need. It just washes over us and we're left picking up the pieces." "What do you need?" Elias asked, the simplest and hardest question he'd ever posed. Alex turned to him, the raw truth spilling out. "I need to not be a story. I need my kid to be safe. I need to do my job without being a poster boy. And the nurses on my floor, they don't need a compassionate care endowment. They need 4 more nurses on the shift so they're not running between 12 patients. They need a counselor who's not booked 6 months out. They need to not have 59% of them burning out because the system is built on their backs breaking. You can't put a fund on that. You have to change the machine." It was the pivotal revelation. Elias had been treating a symptom, his own guilt, not the disease. The real problem wasn't a lack of recognition for extraordinary compassion. It was the systemic erosion that made compassion a superhuman feat. The $5 million was a sprinkler on a forest fire. Elias left that room with a new mission, one far more complex and adversarial than writing a check. He had to leverage his influence not for a one-time gift, but for systemic overhaul. He called an emergency meeting with the hospital board, but this time he brought data. He had his team compile studies on nurse-to-patient ratios, burnout statistics, and the financial cost of high staff turnover. He was no longer a donor asking for a favor. He was a shareholder demanding a restructuring. The board, led by the financially minded CEO, balked. Hearing more staff was a permanent, massive increase in operating costs. The endowment was a gift. This was an ultimatum. The meeting grew heated. Elias played his trump card. He threatened to publicly pull the $5 million and detail exactly why. Because the hospital was prioritizing optics over the well-being of the staff who had cared for his mother. Simultaneously, another force was mobilizing. The local nurses' union, which had been trying to get a hearing with administration for years, saw an unprecedented opportunity. They reached out to Alex. At first, he wanted nothing to do with it. But the union representative, a former nurse named Maria, said something that stuck. "They're using your story to sell a fairy tale. What if we used it to tell the truth?" Worn down, terrified for his future but fueled by a newfound anger for his colleagues, Alex agreed to meet with them privately. He shared the real numbers, the patient loads, the missed breaks, the emotional toll. The union began drafting a public campaign, anchored by the testimony of the now famous angel nurse, demanding safe staffing laws. The hospital administration got wind of it. They summoned Alex to a meeting with HR and his director, Patricia Vance. The tone was cold. They appreciated his dedication, but his collaboration with external advocacy groups, while being a hospital employee, could be seen as a conflict of interest, violating the moral clause in his contract. They suggested a voluntary resignation with a positive reference, or they would be forced to consider termination. Alex was being fired for the compassion that had started it all, the ultimate irony. He left the meeting in a daze, the walls closing in. He had tried to do one right thing, and it had cost him everything: his peace, his daughter's safety, and now his job. When Elias heard, Patricia Vance, sympathetic and furious on Alex's behalf, called him. Something in him snapped. The machine wasn't just broken, it was predatory. It would consume the best among its workers to preserve itself. He had one move left, a move that would burn every bridge he had with the institution. He called a press conference for the following morning on the steps of St. Vincent's. He didn't tell the hospital board. He didn't tell Alex. He simply prepared to speak. The media, smelling a new chapter in the ongoing saga, descended in droves. As the cameras rolled, Elias Thorne stepped to the microphone, not as a billionaire CEO, but as a son who had failed, and as a man who had seen the cost of that failure up close. He held up his mother's notebook, open to the page about the nurse with kind eyes. And he began to tell the real story, not of a check, but of a system at war with its own heart. He named the hospital's threats against Alex Carter. He outlined the safe staffing demands, and he announced that the $5 million endowment was hereby withdrawn, and instead, every cent would be donated to the nurses' union legal fund and to supporting nurses like Alex who were punished for speaking truth. It was a declaration of war, and as he spoke, Alex Carter, watching from Chloe's hospital room window, knew the ground had shifted forever. The tidal wave had finally changed direction. Now it was time to see what the wreckage would reveal and what could be built from the pieces. The fallout from Elias Thorne's press conference was instantaneous and seismic. The hospital's switchboard lit up with calls, half expressing outrage, half expressing support. But inside the executive suite, the reaction was pure, unadulterated panic. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting that lasted through the night. The CEO's initial strategy, to discredit Elias as a grieving son lashing out, collapsed under the weight of the nurses' union's immediate press release, which backed every claim and announced a planned walkout if Alex Carter was not reinstated with full protections. Donors began calling, concerned about the hospital's reputation. The story was no longer a heartwarming human interest piece. It was a blistering expose of systemic failure. Faced with a public relations catastrophe and the threat of a staffing revolt they couldn't weather, the board folded. The next morning, the CEO and the director of nursing, Patricia Vance, personally visited Alex at his apartment. They offered his job back, with a promotion to charge nurse on his shift, a significant raise, and a formal public apology. They also pledged to begin immediate, good-faith negotiations with the union on safe staffing ratios, using the Thorne donation to the legal fund as a stark reminder of the cost of intransigence. Alex accepted his job back but declined the promotion. He didn't want to be management. He wanted to be on the floor with his patients. The raise, however, he accepted without hesitation. For the first time in his adult life, the math of survival had a little breathing room. Elias Thorne's war, however, was just beginning. The hospital board's surrender was just one battle. He had ignited a national conversation. News segments debated nurse burnout and the ethics of healthcare funding. The story of the billionaire who switched sides became a parable. Invitations poured in for Elias to speak, not about quantum computing, but about compassionate capitalism and systemic reform. He declined them all. Instead, he did something far more radical. He listened. He funded a series of town halls across the country, not with him as the speaker, but with nurses, orderlies, and respiratory therapists as the panelists. He sat in the back, taking notes. He learned about the 59% burnout rate not as a statistic, but as a collection of stories of anxiety, depression, and broken marriages. He learned that the trauma of patient death was a cumulative weight that rarely found a healthy outlet. Out of this, the Thorne Foundation for Caregiver Sustainability was born. It was not a traditional charity. It was an aggressive, advocacy-focused entity. It lobbied for state-level safe staffing laws. It funded free, confidential, and immediately accessible mental health services specifically for healthcare workers, with no caps on sessions. It created grants for nurses to go back to school for advanced degrees, with no strings attached. The initial $5 million was just the seed. Elias committed 1% of his personal net worth, over $900 million, to an irrevocable trust to fund it in perpetuity. The final, surprising detail emerged 6 months later during the foundation's launch gala. Elias was on stage, outlining the mission. Then he called Alex Carter to join him. Alex, uncomfortable in a suit, stood beside him. Elias turned to the audience of philanthropists and policymakers. "The Foundation's first executive director of clinical outreach," Elias announced, "will be someone who understands the work from the ground up every single day. Someone who embodies the compassion we're trying to sustain. My friend, Alex Carter." Alex was stunned. They had discussed his advisory role, but not this. It was a full-time position with a salary that would transform his and Chloe's lives, focusing on program development and peer support networks. He could still work shifts per diem to stay connected to the floor, but his advocacy would now be his career. He looked at Elias, who gave a slight, encouraging nod. Alex took the microphone, his voice thick with emotion. "My job," he said, "has always been about making sure people aren't alone in their hardest moments. Now, our job is to make sure the people doing that job aren't alone either." The story had come full circle. The compassion Alex showed in one room rippled out to change the landscape of care for thousands. The billionaire who arrived too late used his resources not for penance, but for partnership. A year later, the changes at St. Vincent's were tangible. New hires had eased the patient load. A dedicated wellness office was staffed with counselors. Nurse turnover dropped by 15%. Alex, in his foundation role, helped design a compassionate handoff protocol, ensuring no dying patient was without a dedicated staff presence, formalizing the choice he had once made alone. Elias and Alex's relationship deepened into a genuine friendship, built on mutual respect, not pity or gratitude. Elias became a fixture at Chloe's soccer games. Alex became the only person who could tell Elias to stop working and get some sleep. The story ends not with a dramatic climax, but with a quiet moment of continuity. Alex is back on the night shift per diem by choice. He enters a room where an elderly man is dying, his family unable to be there until morning. Alex pulls up a chair, takes the man's hand, and begins to read softly from a book. It's a scene that repeats in hospitals every night. But now, because of the tumult that started in room 317, the nurse in that chair knows there's a system behind him that recognizes the value of this work, that supports his endurance, and that will catch him if the weight becomes too heavy. He is not just holding a patient's hand. He is the living proof that compassion, when seen and supported, can become the most powerful engine for change. The helicopter on the roof was the beginning of the storm, but the quiet man in the chair was the beginning of the solution. So what is the real currency of care? This story began with two forms of wealth in direct opposition. One counted in billions, the other in bedtime stories and overtime hours. We saw that money, for all its power, arrived too late to hold a hand. But we also saw that raw compassion, alone, is unsustainable. It burns out under the weight of a broken system. The true transformation happened when these two forces stopped opposing each other and started listening. Alex Carter's compassion was the spark, but without Elias Thorne's resources and platform, that spark would have remained a solitary, fading light. And without the pressure of a nurse's, union and public accountability, those resources would have been just another band-aid on a hemorrhaging wound. The lesson isn't that billionaires are saviors, or that nurses are saints. The lesson is that our systems of care are only as strong as the support we give to the caregivers within them. We ask extraordinary humanity from people like Alex every single day, in emergency rooms, in nursing homes, in quiet hospital rooms at 3 a.m., and then we build systems that treat that humanity as an infinite free resource. The story of the single dad nurse and the billionaire son is ultimately about closing a profound disconnect. It's about recognizing that the most valuable work in our society often has the lowest price tag, until the moment its absence costs us everything. So here's a question for you. When was the last time you truly saw the person caring for you or someone you love? Not just the uniform, not just the title, but the exhausted human being behind it. Have you ever been that person, giving everything you have with no safety net underneath? The change starts with that recognition. It starts when we stop asking for superhuman compassion and start building human systems to support it. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the invisible labor that holds our world together, then do this for me. Hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that stories with heart matter more than just controversy. Share this video with one person, a friend, a family member, someone who works in healthcare. Tell them you see them. And subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell. We dedicate ourselves to finding and telling the human stories that reveal who we are and who we can be. Stories of quiet courage, of unexpected connections, of the moments that change everything. Thanks for watching. And remember, the most advanced technology in the world still can't replicate the simple, enduring power of a hand to hold. See you in the next story.